Good. Still morning, everyone. First, I want to thank Joshua and Darren for giving us a treasure trove of information when it came to the AI and technology piece. If you have any questions for any presenter or panelists today, you can find them during lunch. My name is Karim French. I am the project coordinator for nonprofit capacity building and also the healthcare workforce development team at Molloy University. I want to welcome you again to our Suffolk Center. I have the opportunity to welcome and present our speakers today. They'll be addressing keys to laying a foundation for your board to help them thrive. They are covering strategic board composition, clear roles and responsibilities, effective onboarding and engagement and accountability. Please welcome Kristen Deska, co-founder of Bell's Board and Nonprofit Sector Strategies, President, Nonprofit Resource. Ken Cerini, Managing Partner at Cerini Associates, founder of the Imagine Award and board member of the Nonprofit Resource Hub. David Goldstein, Esquire, Certilman, Balin, and Hyman, LLP, board member of Nonprofit Resource Hub.
All right. Good almost afternoon. I know we are standing between you and your lunch. We are going to make this as riveting as possible. Let me see if I can get our deck going. Here we go. Okay. So it's actually nice to go after some of the morning talks because it all kind of ties together, right? So much of what we heard Josh just mentioned ties into engaging your board in fundraising or engaging your board in general. And so you'll hear from me and then our accountant and then our lawyer in chief and then our accountant. So I think Laura really mentioned this a lot, right? Do we know what we're asking for? Do we know where we're going? So I would be doing you all an injustice if I didn't start out by saying with board engagement, with managing your board, with having an effective board of directors, all roads lead back to where? Strategic planning and knowing your organization's strategic goals. So I strongly suggest before you kind of dive into really thinking about, oh my gosh, if only my board could do this, if only my board, if only we had this person, to really just think back and take a moment and what are our strategic goals? Where are we as an organization going? And how do we then think about the type of board, that composition that really drives us toward our mission? So I only have 3 slides and then I'm going to turn it over to David. So I really wanted to just make the most of this time. So the key number 2, after you've kind of reinforced your strategic goals and you know where you're going and you're starting to think, what kind of board of directors do I need to get there? What are some things that you need to think about? It's that assessment moment, right? We are all running around. I would say the biggest challenge I have in consulting is the overwhelm that the nonprofit staff I work with are facing, wearing so many hats and not being able to take that moment and assess where we are. So what are some of the questions we should be taking a minute to ask ourselves? Is our board representative of the communities we serve? Right. More often than not, we all can work on this. And how can we really think about this in a more strategic way? Are we fostering a sense of belonging? We are human beings. When we go into that room and we don't know anyone, are our board members going to want to stay with us? Are they feeling rewarded from being part of our group? Are we kind of going that extra mile to make sure they feel part of the organization, part of the mission? Do our meetings encourage discussion and participation? Are we going into a meeting where it's yay or nay, the whole meeting, and then it's adjourned? And what are we really gaining from that? So what are some things we can think about to make our meetings more interactive? That leads us right into how are we offering what I call, and I stole this from one of my clients, mission moments. How are we creating the space for board members to have more access to being part of the mission? When we do your why, so I facilitate a lot of board retreats, and the best way to start the day is, what is your why? Why did you become a board member? And why are you still here? Why is this organization inspiring to you? And every time I cry, and I try to hide it because I'm a facilitator and I'm not supposed to cry, but the meaning behind your service is really important to remind ourselves of. And by offering mission moments, a board member will usually say, my why is because I read to kids 2 weeks ago and their faces, you remember that feeling? And those are the things we need to be reminded of, because what does that allow our board members to then be? Our best ambassadors. And that's really what we want our board members to be thinking about. Next question, how effective is our committee structure? This is a typical topic at board retreats, really taking that moment to think about how are our committees operating, right? This is often where the real work gets done. Ken will often say, if you join a board and you're not joining a committee as well, are you really an active member of that board? Ken will usually say it should be required. And many, I see nodding heads. It really is important, because how are you really getting immersed in the work of the organization if you're not also taking that step to serve on a committee? But it goes well beyond that. Second to last question, do we make it easy for members to access their governance information? Do members know where they can find that infographic or one pager that they need to know how to convey the impact of your mission? Is there an easy way for them to see how successful you've been this past year? Do they know your 3 priorities? Let's go back to what Laura said, right? Your board members should really know, as your ambassadors, what are those top 3 priorities, and be ready to tell someone and be ready to introduce themselves as being a part of your organization. And then finally, do we communicate expectations effectively? We still have so much of the, oh, she's wonderful, she's so well spoken. Yes, she's on our board now. But have we really communicated to that individual what we need from them, what we expect from them? Is it 3 particular relationships? Is it showing up at these particular events? So a lot of the time I talk about an expectations checklist of sorts. David hates when I call it a contract. An expectations list where your board can really keep tabs throughout the year of their participation, their engagement, and what is expected of them. So anytime we can more clearly communicate, we will have a more successful and engaged board. And ultimately, our mission impact will grow. All right, so my final slide for takeaways. So what are some tangible tactics that we can consider for building this type of engagement? You can use ChatGPT to tell you exactly why a board matrix is helpful, it turns out, thanks to Amy. I was going into a session and I said, I'm about to introduce a board matrix. Let me make sure I know all of the reasons. And I knew, I think, like 8 of 12, but ChatGPT filled in my other 3. So how many of you have ever done a board matrix exercise with your group? Judy, of course. So a board matrix is where you basically get a quick assessment, and I've created a digital form that I'd be happy to share the template if anyone wants it. You can basically fill out and see the span of your board members' skill sets, your board members' representation, your board members' inclination to give and how they want to give. You can ask these questions and have it populate in a way where you can see, wow, of my board, only 12 of 20 actually have a background in financial management. And maybe we're a financial literacy organization. Like, these epiphanies kind of happen when you have that data. And it's literally a form that takes 3 to 5 minutes for a board member to fill out. And then you have something to kind of start more conversations with your members about, oh, wow, we should really be recruiting someone for this. But again, why? The why should be because one of our strategic priorities is because we need to grow in this arena. And that's the type of board member skill sets we're looking for. A self-assessment is another best practice. It allows board members to look within and kind of come to their own understanding of, wow, I intended to do XYZ when I joined this board, but so far I've actually only attended 1 event. Because why? Lives get busy, right? It's not anything intentional. We all go in with good intentions. Thirdly, a board portal. We should have a central resource for all of our information, no matter what that is for your organization, but a place where board members know where to go to easily access meeting minutes, bylaws, all of these important documents. And the final 2 is to connect your members to education and support. You should all be telling your members about events like this, about all of the amazing webinars that David's firm is having, Ken's firm is having, so that your board members feel more in the loop with what's going on in the nonprofit sector, because they're mostly business people. Business people are not in tune and they're not in this huddle with all of us on a daily basis. All right, I'm getting the hook. And finally, a board retreat. And I see one of our clients in the audience, oh, board retreat, our board won't go for that. Well, let me tell you, there are ways to do this. And it is so important to make that space for those conversations with your board. You can do it in a half day. You don't even need to bring in a facilitator. There are ways you can make it happen, and it makes all the difference. So with that, I'll turn it over to David. I think I'm going to save these for the end, actually. Let me go over to David to do his piece, and I'll move out of the way.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everybody. Couple of things to get, items to get out of the way. First of all, this isn't legal advice, it's for educational purposes. I need to say that. And the other thing that I need to say, and I've got obviously a lot of information and a little bit of time, so I apologize. I'm gonna talk very quickly. I promise if you reach out to me, not here, I will talk more slowly. But the other thing I want to say, and this is kind of going back to a phrase that Laura used this morning. She talked about being endlessly entertaining. I am not endlessly entertaining, unfortunately, nor is nonprofit governance endlessly entertaining. That's what I'm going to talk about. But I want to emphasize it's fundamental, it's critical, and honestly, I view my role as helping my clients make sure that they can focus on their mission and not get derailed by problems caused by improper and deficient governance. So I'm going to talk about accountability. I'm going to talk about clear roles and responsibility and about engagement, and I'm going to go very quickly. So 2 levels of accountability I want to talk about. So first, there's the internal corporate accountability, and we hear a lot about one part of that, but it's actually a two-way street, and I think a lot of people do themselves and their organization a disservice by not realizing it's a two-way street. So everyone focuses on the accountability of the board member to the organization. Are you on committees? Are you reading materials? Are you coming to meetings? Are you making contributions, et cetera, et cetera? But really, accountability, as I said, flows both ways, and it's imperative that leaders are aware of what the board members' experience is. So we talked about materials. Well, materials should get to, first of all, they should be very accessible, digestible, and they should get to board members on a timely basis, not 15 minutes or 15 hours before the meeting. On a fundamental level, do we have sufficient directors and officers liability insurance to protect our board members? And overall, what are our meetings like? What's the board members' experience like? Do we have people on the board who like to hear themselves talk and take over the meeting and make it a very unpleasant experience for everybody else? Are our meetings 4 hours long? That can happen sometimes, but that shouldn't happen every time. And that's a great way to lose board members and lose board members' attention. So that's something that leaders, that part of the two-way street is something that leaders have to always be focused on. Legal accountability, as you might imagine, that's something that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. Accountability lies at the heart of New York nonprofit law. And if we took a CT scan of the heart of New York nonprofit law, what we'd see is this: fiduciary duties. And my clients have a running joke: how long in any conversation with me before I mentioned fiduciary duties? This was probably about 2 minutes, but which is actually long. Usually it's faster. So directors have legal duties under New York law. And what a lot of people don't realize, and this is nothing you want to be surprised with later on, there can be personal liability to directors for breaching those legal duties. So there are 3 fundamental legal duties: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, the duty of obedience. The duty of care is basically the oversight function, and this is explicitly set forth in section 717A of the not-for-profit corporation law. It requires familiarity with the organization's finances and activities and regular participation in its governance. And the duty of care is basically that a director has to discharge the duties of his or her position in good faith and with the care an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances. A lot of words, but it's sound and prudent oversight. And if you want to see how this comes back and can bite board members, in the materials I included, everybody's got a book. There's a summons from a 2016 case where the board of Healing Arts Initiative was sued, and if you look at the suit, really what the summons says in explicit words, quoting the statute, is that the board exercised a lack of oversight because they did not exercise prudence the way an ordinarily prudent person would in a similar circumstance. And you don't want to be on the other side of those kinds of allegations. Duty of loyalty: a director has to act in the interest of the organization. This requires undivided allegiance to the organization's mission when using the power of his or her position or information concerning the organization or its property. And we see this in conflicts of interest. That's where duty of loyalty comes into play, and in particular, related party transactions. New York law has probably the most demanding rules in the country on conflicts and related party transactions, something that is used in private litigation and also in government enforcement actions. Duty of obedience, this is the least understood and most often neglected. It's very straightforward. You've got to comply with applicable laws and regulations and with your internal governance documents. This is very complicated because there are multiple layers of laws and regulations, federal, state, local. You've got to comply with all of them, and in particular, the not-for-profit corporation law. It's a law. The standard is not best efforts under difficult circumstances. There are mandatory requirements, bright lines. It's inflexible and unforgiving. Compliance with internal governance documents is the other part of the duty of obedience. That's a certificate of incorporation, bylaws, policies, including conflict of interest policy. Traps for the unwary here. It's very easy to forget about your certificate of incorporation. It's the first document you do when you start. But the corporate purposes are contained in there, and it's a fundamental responsibility of board members to make sure that there are no use of corporate assets and no activities outside of corporate purposes. Compliance with bylaws and compliance with the not-for-profit corporation law. I'm gonna fast forward. I'm going to talk quickly about clear roles and responsibilities and engagement. Christine mentioned the use of committees. That's a necessary division of labor. There's no way that a board can do all this by everybody doing everything. So division of labor is critical, but then it starts getting technical because the law has a distinction between board committees that can have some piece of delegated board authority. Only board members can be voting members of those committees. And then there are committees of the corporation that can have board members and non-board members. They are only advisory. Audit committee is the only committee that has its own section of the not-for-profit corporation law dedicated to it. That's something to pay attention to. It's got a critical role in nonprofit governance, and having a governance committee, as you can see, this needs continual focus by a group on the board. So a governance committee is essential. Engagement, the flow of information to the board. I don't want to get away from that. That's something we really need to focus on. Timely and adequate flow of information to the board is required for the board to be able to do its oversight that it's required to do under the law. And of course, the unintended consequence of insufficient information is a breach of fiduciary duty. So adequate oversight it's never equivalent to trust. Trust is a word we don't ever want to hear in the governance context. Volunteers doing the best they can. Again, that's not the standard. You can have a very smart and accomplished board. The litigation against the Dowling Board of Directors is an example of a smart and accomplished board, but they didn't do what they needed to under the statute. Quality and timeliness of information. In your materials is the Dowling litigation. I'm going to wrap up in 1 second. There, the entire board and the CFO got sued for breach of fiduciary duty. And the essence of that lawsuit, and we're standing 17 miles from where I'm standing, you're sitting 17 miles from where Dowling was because it went bankrupt and closed. And you've got some quotes here from the Dowling complaint. Bottom line is the board didn't get sufficient information. Their systems didn't enable them to have reliable or accurate information upon which they could make informed business decisions, and that led to a lawsuit against all of them. So again, 3 quick takeaways. Never lose sight. There we go. I skipped past it. Okay, but you'll access it online. Never lose sight of your fiduciary duties, not even for a minute. Information is king. Information flow. Quality and timeliness of the information. That's what you need for oversight, and accountability is a two-way street between the board members and the organization. Thanks. Sorry for the speed talking.
So David's going to be sticking around in the lunchroom afterwards to sign his book. I'm going to be talking a little bit about risk, and I know the biggest risk at this moment is probably me standing in the way of lunch. What we're going to be doing is we were each talking for 8 minutes, and that's what we're trying to stay on target with. The reason for that is we want to leave some time for you guys to ask questions. So my focus is going to be on risk. And there's a lot of different risks. And the reason I bring up risk is I don't think risk is discussed enough in board meetings. And I think, when you think about what a board does, sometimes the board can get caught up in a lot of the minutia of what happens, we're, discussing fundraising events and things like that. That's not really, really the main focus of what a board should be. Board should really be looking at forward thinking, as Christine mentioned, strategic planning, thought process, where are we going to take this organization as we move forward? And the board has a responsibility also from an oversight perspective, as David was talking about. They have fiduciary duties and fiduciary responsibilities. And I think part of that kind of comes with the understanding of what's the risks out there that the board needs to address. We are big proponents of having a risk committee within an organization, a nonprofit organization. That risk committee should include board members, should include key members of management, should include if you have compliance officers and stuff like that within your organization, and even some of the line folks within an organization. What sort of things kind of come into play from a nonprofit risk perspective? Well, I mean, think about the economy right now, right? What's happening in the economy? So New York State passed a budget last year or the beginning of this year, and New York State's budget wasn't bad because there's a lot of federal funds that have come into the state, and New York State has been living off those federal funds for the last few years. Guess what? They're gone. So when we get into next year's budget, the 25 budget, because the budget goes into effect in April, you're going to be in a situation where a lot of those funds have dried up. So if you're sitting here and you're putting together budgets for next year for your organizations, you're going to be thinking about that. You got to be looking forward and saying, okay, what is our organizational budget going to look like? And we can't just take last year and say that's what this year is going to look like, because you're probably going to see some cuts. So we're big proponents on contingency budgets. So when you establish a budget, don't just establish one budget, establish multiple budgets. What happens if 5% decline, a 10% decline in operations? And if that happens, what cuts are we going to make? We should have that pre-established up front so that we can move pretty quickly and be nimble in the process. Think about inflation, think about interest rates, think about what impact that's having on your organization's spending power and incorporating that into your risk tolerance. Internal financial information. You have to have good, as David mentioned, good, timely internal financial information. Budget is probably the most important thing from a fiscal oversight perspective that the board has, right? That is your roadmap. It's kind of your way that you have a nav system that keeps you on track, and that's what your budget is. You need to get, as a board, budget to actual information so that you can really ensure that the organization is spending the way the organization is supposed to be spending. I can't stand when organizations create a break-even budget and say, hey, look, we got an break-even budget. You want a budget for profit, right? I mean, you're a business. You're not a nonprofit. You can make money. You should make money as a nonprofit organization. So, we encourage our organizations to budget profitability within their budgets, because what that does is helps you build fiscal stability within your organization and helps you open up opportunity, right? If I have money, if I have resources, I have the ability to act on opportunity. What happens if there's another nonprofit organization out there that might be a good merger partner? If I have resources, I might be able to help them get through a period of time before they run out of cash flow, and I can kind of pull them in and make them part of our organization. So really, fiscal stability allows you to cover some downticks in the marketplace. It allows you for opportunity. And as David mentioned before, information is power. You need accurate, timely, current information. A board can't be getting information 5 minutes before a meeting. You need to have enough time to review it, digest it, understand it, ask questions about it, so that the board has the information they need. And the other question is, at what level does that information come? What should that information look like, right? I mean, if I'm trying to make a decision about my organization, I've got 27 different programs, and I'm getting global information about the entire organization. Really, what is that allowing me as a board member to do? Do I really understand how each of those programs are doing? Do I understand the importance of each of those programs to the overall mission of the organization? And then compliance. There's so many different levels of compliance that you need to think about. Grant compliance and monitoring. Every grant comes with rules and regulations and pitfalls that you can fall into. So you need to make sure that there's someone within the organization who's paying attention and monitoring the grants. Regulations, audits, and takebacks. So you're in this situation where I can make certain guarantees to you. The first guarantee is that regulations will change. They change on a regular basis. Second guarantee is someone, if you're getting government funded, is probably going to come in and audit you, and they're going to look to try to take back money. I can tell you about 6 years ago, the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities was in a fight with providers. and the provider said, we need a bigger amount of money, and OPWD said, no, we can't give it to you. And they finally acquiesced because they said, yeah, we'll just give it to you, but we'll take it back on audit. So, understand that this is the mentality that's out there with respect to governmental funding. You have to pay attention to restriction on funds. If you're taking restricted donations and restricted funds, you have a legal responsibility to use those funds the way those restrictions are established. You can't just sit here. If you put something on your website that says, donate to this fund for this purpose, and someone does, you have to abide by that because that is a restriction you've placed on those funds, or that has been placed on those funds. So you want to make sure that, and if you do have restricted funds, whether they be temporarily or permanently restricted in an endowment, and you have investments, there's other laws that come into play. How many of you have heard of NIPMFA, the New York Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act? A couple of you. If you have investments or you have endowments, you better get to know NIPMFA because you have certain rules and regulations that you need to do. The Q&A function. Do you have a Q&A function within your organization? Do you have a compliance officer? If you have over $500,000 worth of Medicaid funding in New York State, you're required to have a Medicaid compliance officer in place. So these are all things that you need to kind of keep in mind, and a lot of things that the board isn't thinking about or the board doesn't even know about. You need to have a strong internal control environment. Board sets policy, management puts in place or implements procedures around those policies, and it's the board's responsibility to monitor that those procedures and policies are being met. Because the last thing you want is for there to be a breakdown in the internal controls, fraud takes place, and think what that does to your reputation. Cybersecurity issues, there was a kind of a discussion about AI and stuff, but the other big hot topic in IT is cybersecurity. Nonprofit cyber attacks are on the rise. We've have several clients that have gotten hit, and you'd really have to make sure you're paying attention to that. You need to educate. You need to make sure that you're protecting client and donor information. You got HIPAA and FERPA rules. Staffing issues. How many of you guys are having difficulty hiring staff? Pretty much everyone. So when you think about it, that's a risk. If I can't hire the right staff, I could be putting exposure on my organization. You have changing Department of Labor, IRS, and other regulations. There's been pension lawsuits happening at hospitals and universities, and who knows if that's going to be trickling down where employees are suing their employers because their pension plans either offer too many options or there's not enough education around pension and stuff. And some of that's now creeping into healthcare. Leadership retooling, think about it. A lot of us learned from our managers who were baby boomers. And so we have a baby boomer style of management. By the year 2025, 27% of the workforce will be Gen Z, which have a completely different style. So you have to kind of marry the two of those, which means you need leadership training, succession planning. 70% of the people who are in leadership positions today in nonprofit organizations have said they will not be there in 5 years. So kind of keep that in mind. I know I have like less than 30 seconds, or I'm already over my time. Think about insurance. When was the last time you had your insurance reviewed? Not just for pricing, but also for coverage. When you think about funding levels, 2022 is the largest decline in fundraising, fourth time in 40 years. Bigger gifts, less people. In the year 2000, 70% of people gave to charity. We're down to 50%. So there's a lot of things that people need to think about. I'm going to kind of stop there. And really the goal here is really just to open things up for questions for the three of us. So if anybody has questions, we're more than happy to pop over here if people have questions. So Frank.
David, you actually, Ken, you raised the issue, but I think David's got the answer, hopefully. So I sit on a board that has restricted funds and unrestricted funds. So as a board member, how am I going to know? What level do I have to go to know that perhaps the unrestricted funds, the restricted funds are being dipped into?
So taking a step back before I give this answer, listening to what we're all saying, this is a lot, right? How do you do this without proper internal staff and proper external support? The answer is you can't. There's too much to do here. So that drilling down to the specifics, you need to have that information presented to you as the board. The board needs to get continuous information about what's restricted, what's unrestricted. And to add to what Ken said, you've got a contract with the donor, even if it's not written, to use the funds only in accordance with the restriction, and it's a breach of fiduciary duty.
I didn't answer the question right. What is my risk as a board member if they're not playing right at admin and management.
The buck stops with you. It's up
Yeah,
to
let me jump in a second. I think part of it is you have a responsibility to set policy. You have a responsibility to ensure and monitor that the organization has in place proper controls. So, that's where your responsibility lies. If you don't do that and you're not getting proper communication from the internal staff with respect to the internal control environment and how things are working, that's where you could wind up with a
You
problem.
are doing it, but management is playing fast and loose. Then is the board member liable?
That's where the continuous reporting comes in and you're responsible for oversight. That's part of your
All right.
oversight function. And again,
Got it.
fiduciary duty, liability.
Thank you.
Can either you or Dave just explain to the group that restricted funds are donor restricted as opposed to discussing board restrictions? Because I think we go astray there.
So the only person who can restrict a contribution is a donor. Okay, board members often say, I want to take certain funds and put them away or put them on the side. Those are board designated funds. So if a donor makes a restriction that you cannot spend the money and that the money is supposed to be held in perpetuity, that's an endowment. A board can say, we want to set funds aside for long term. That's a quasi endowment. But those are not restricted funds. Those are funds without restriction. So again, the only person who can restrict the fund is a donor.
Good question, Judy.
All right, come on, guys, this is your
We
time.
have
What
5
questions
more
you guys got?
minutes before lunch.
We're not leaving for lunch early, so if you don't ask questions, it's gonna sit here in silence.
It's on the similar topic, so, I'm not part of the board, but it was asked to me, because I am in finances, that if they had allotted a certain amount of money, for a specific project, and they had to like dig deep into their pockets, and they had to use $14,000 for that project, can they fundraise for that project backwards? Like, they want to fundraise to kind of recoup that money. Is that legal
So
or not?
what you're saying is that the board spent money on a project.
Right, in
And then
operations.
and after they spent the money on the project, they now want to go and raise the money for that project and
Correct.
refund the general fund for
Correct.
those funds.
Is that legal?
Is it legal? I wouldn't call it a best practice. I don't know that I would necessarily encourage one of my clients to do that because the funds are already spent. So it's kind of hard to go back in time. But David?
But you can communicate with your donors and explain exactly what the situation is and to recoup that money for our general funds, for general operating expenses. Can you do that for us?
So
So-
it doesn't become ethically ambiguous.
Thank you.
That's kind of my tagline. I am ethically ambiguous, yes. Anybody else? Come on. We talked really fast, so you guys had time.
I just want to, can you clarify, you mentioned certificate of incorporation and purpose clause. Explain why you mentioned that so people understand why they need to be looking at it at least once a year.
At least once a year. So in your certificate of incorporation, there's a provision, it's required, the Department of State won't incorporate you without it, where you have to set forth your corporate purposes. As of July 1st, 2014, if you were incorporated after that, you could have very broad corporate purposes. You could say that we're incorporated to do anything that a charitable nonprofit could do in New York State. That's great. And that change was made by the legislature because this was such an endemic problem in the nonprofit sector. Very often certificates of incorporation are very specific. The reality is that the board is a fundamental piece of your fiduciary duty as a board member is to make sure that nothing you do is outside of the four corners of the purposes in your certificate of incorporation. You can't use any corporate assets for that. So if you've got very specific purposes, but if you're a well governed, well-managed nonprofit, you're going to evolve over time, and inevitably you're going to start going beyond what your purposes are. So you're able to amend your purposes, but there's a process to do that. You need Attorney General approval if you're a charitable nonprofit to amend your purposes. So you really need to, as Judy said, you need to keep your eye on your corporate purposes at least once a year. And that's where a governance committee comes in very handy and measure what you're doing against your corporate purposes. When I meet a new client, the first thing I do is I order their certificate of incorporation from state, and I look at their website. And I see, is there a mismatch between what they're doing and what they're allowed to do? And no activity, no matter how worthy, outside of your purposes is permissible. And literally, the board members, again, to Frank's earlier point, the board members, the buck stops with them. They are responsible for monitoring that. And if you do something outside, you as an organization do something outside of your corporate purposes, the board members could be sued to replenish that money into the corporate accounts. So you just really need to always monitor your purposes and make sure you're acting within those four corners.
Yeah, David and I worked on a client where the organization went to add a service to their certificate of incorporation. They actually made a mistake and actually replaced their purpose with something that represented about 1% of what the organization really does. And they were operating for about 7 years with the fact that all they did was this small thing when they did all of this. So, I mean, if there would have been an issue or a problem, their D&O coverage may have said, we're not going to pay because you were not following law. So something to really keep in mind.
And that's so easy, as I said earlier, the first document, literally, technically, when you start is your certificate of incorporation. So very often it gets filed away and nobody thinks about it again. But to Judy's point, you need to be looking at it constantly.
Any other questions?
It's actually a shameless plug for you, but we just got Bell's board. And all of that information is so easily accessible now because we struggled, we were over here, we were over there. Now it's all in one thing. And I feel like we're more controlled and I feel like the board members have more access to everything that we're doing now.
I missed that. What was that product?
I did not pay Eileen. to
No,
say
you
that.
didn't,
Thank
but
you.
I'm just thinking of how grateful I am that I have it, and that's why I'm saying it. And it could be Bell's board, it could be any other tool. But we were all
Some
over,
other
we were all over the place. We were kind of all over the place, and I feel like that, for me, I feel like my board now has the tools they need to be able to do what they need to do.
But look out for file cabinet syndrome, and you could have that electronically as well.
Yeah.
Dating myself a little, but so you put your certificate of incorporation in a file cabinet, you never look at it again.
Right.
Okay, it's there on Bell's board, but
Right.
somebody's got to be responsible, and that's where a governance committee is essential. Somebody's got to have that lens constantly to be looking at that purposes clause and looking at your bylaws and looking at your conflict of interest policy. And that's, again, a governance committee is an invaluable tool, a necessary tool, if you ask me, to do that.
Okay, I think it's lunchtime, so we have Stephanie, before everybody goes, from JMT, who is sponsoring the lunch. So if she doesn't talk, we don't need.
You're our favorite person now.
Everybody, great job, right, Ken? Every time I hear you guys talk, so thank you for that. So I'm Stephanie Rose Belcher. I'm the COO of JMT Consulting. Some of you may have heard of us. JMT is, we're experts in mission-driven nonprofit finance. A lot of words, but what we really specialize in is helping our nonprofit clients maximize the efficiency of their financial operations on the accounting side, on the budget and planning side, and all of the attendant other processes that occur around the management of money. And we do this through the implementation of software, services, and ongoing support. And if you want to learn more about that, my colleague Phil and I are at our table, so you can come see us. And one shameless plug, we run an annual customer conference. It will be in Boston in May, and many of the wonderful speakers that you heard here today will be back up with us again, going into some really great detail on accounting rules, compliance rules, what have you. And it's a great conference. It's purely educational. Certainly no one complains if somebody says, hey, I'm interested in this and wants to buy, but we really run this honestly to help educate all of our nonprofit clients, or even those who aren't our clients, on all of those financial aspects. And it's also a lot of fun. So thrilled to have you. We are about to break for lunch. We would ask all of us that you stop by and see all of the Resource Hub's associate members and talk to them and learn what they do. They made today possible. So we hope that you're able to at least chat with everybody and enjoy the lunch.